And the first 30 seconds of this track is kind of me kind of figuring something out. Actually, when we were kind of doing post-production, I was telling Mark, I kind of want to cut those first 30 seconds out because it sounds like I can tell that I'm just fiddling around and I don't really hit an idea until after that. And then Mark was saying, well, that's kind of cool that you kind of, the listeners get to experience you exploring and finding that kind of pocket.
This is Champagne is Also a Band podcast. One songwriter, one song. I'm Sven, your host for a journey into the music of Champaign-Urbana. Recorded in the Blue Box studio with a songwriter from the Champaign-Urbana music scene, past or present. Champagne is Also a Band podcast is proud to be a part of the Champagne Showers Podcast Network. Welcome to Champagne is Also a Band podcast. Today, I have James Mauck of Forebeat. So, you may know James from such bands as Sweet Milk, Afro-D and Global Soundwaves, Grand Ambassador, Dropsy, Lord Grizzly, Pamela Marcella, A Square Peg Surrounded by Round Holes, and Siriano Aftermath. You've also been part of some cover bands such as Spaceport, Triple Play, Nickel and Dimes, Lou DiBello Band, Sojourn Rocks, and Matter of Days. So James, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to be talking about your piece, Current, off of the album Stages of Growth. So without further ado, let's listen to the song. Welcome back. So, of course, my first and favorite question to always ask is what came first? Was it the music or was it the lyrics? But I feel like with an instrumental piece, I like to think about when constructing this piece, composing this piece, what was the first thing that happened? What was the first motif that you created? What was like what triggered this pursuit of creating this song?
So this project, Stages of Growth, it's been between my first and this current project was about I think 6 years. I've been kind of dragging my feet on getting a recording done. And I just kind of went ahead and scheduled a time with Mark, like, hey, let's do this late July. And I didn't really have a game plan until then. But the day before, I took a trip over to Allerton Park on a Sunday evening, and it was completely empty. And I just walked around the grounds and listened to the bird calls. I even kind of transcribed the rhythms of the bird calls. It's kind of we're just really taking in just the vibes and the views and kind of everything about the forest and the statues and just kind of the overall ambiance of it. And then came in the next morning to the recording studio, kind of refreshed. And this piece was actually 2 separate improvisations that we layered on top of each other after the fact.
My brain, I don't know if you want to say even within the experimental or improvisational works, I still think about, does it tell a story? Is there a mental picture? Is there something that is driving the overall improvisation, or is it a thought exercise? Is it an emotional exercise? And I'm kind of curious about your overall process in terms of developing a piece that has the framework in which you improvise over the top of. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm curious about how you think about the work that you do, and especially within the context of this piece. Is it a thought experiment? Is it an idea story? Is it an emotional exercise? I mean, I'm curious about what's happening in your head while you're working on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when it comes to improvisation in general, I try to think of it, instead of thinking of it as making stuff up, I try to think of it as spontaneous composition. That way, I'm more intentional about the things I'm playing. For this particular piece, I had 2 drumsticks in each hand, and I stole that idea from Steve Gadd. I forget what track he played. I think he either did it on a Steely Dan track or I'm not completely sure which one, but he did that quite a bit, and I've seen YouTube videos of him playing that way. So I just picked up 2 sticks at a time and just started playing, and that's why you can kind of hear this kind of woody clicking sound whenever I hit a drum. It's those 2 sticks in one hand kind of clicking together. And the first 30 seconds of this track is kind of me kind of figuring something out. Actually, when we were kind of doing post-production, I was telling Mark, I kind of want to cut those first 30 seconds out because it sounds like I can tell that I'm just fiddling around and I don't really hit an idea until after that. And then Mark was saying, well, that's kind of cool that you kind of, the listeners get to experience you exploring and finding that kind of pocket. So I decided this whole project is kind of just there are quite a few what I would call mistakes on this record, but I kind of embraced that kind of just nakedness a little bit and just kind of enjoy that kind of, because that's what my live shows are like. There's a lot of improvisation and of course a lot of errors in a way,
Sure.
What I would call.
There's a certain level of vulnerability that comes through in that performance because it is naked is the right, no, I mean, I
I don't know if I picked a different word.
Yeah, I mean, but exposed.
Yeah, exposed.
I mean, exposed. I always find that fascinating because what makes a lot of improvisation and exploration in terms of music interesting is the serendipity type mistakes that give it a certain flavor. I mean, I appreciate your live shows, and usually I appreciate the live shows over hearing a recording of something that is improvised but recorded. I think mainly normally because there is a kind of guarded quality, because it's well, I want to make sure that I get this right, and I want to make sure that I nail this. But then it loses that particular energy. And I do think in listening to the overall stages of growth, I feel like it does have that I don't even want to say it's like mistakes, but it has a life to it. It has some energy that doesn't die because it's in the studio. And I think that's one of the things that I find really remarkable about the recording process, as well as your techniques in terms of conveying that, I don't know, connection to your instrument, but also like back to that whole vulnerable thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's really remarkable. You mentioned that you had even, did you say transcribed? I checks notes.
Yeah.
Transcribed some of the rhythms and even the melody, sorry, you transcribed the rhythms of some of the bird calls.
And kind of like, I didn't like, do the exact notes, but I was like, that's a high note versus a low note, and that way I could kind of transfer that to my instrument a little bit.
Well, and I was wondering if some of the, when you get to halfway through about 240, there's that 3-note melody that you do, and I was like, oh, that's kind of the birds calling back and forth to each other, and even kind of the overlapping of their notes, making it not necessarily seem like the normal diatonic melodic line. I don't mean to jump forward to that part, but I am curious, but because we're here, I'm curious how you think about creating a melody within something that tends to be very, can I say drum driven? Is that, I just don't want to be like drum driven so that it's so hard, because it's not, it's rhythm driven more than it is the instrument, but it's also very much the instrument. I don't know if that's making any sense, but it's like, this is my own brain working through the abstract qualities of rhythm and the way that you interpret, I want to say staying in the pocket, but also bouncing around the pocket in a very nice, I don't know, playful way even. I don't know if there was a great question there, but I'm just curious about how you think of incorporating other instruments, maybe even more melodic instruments.
The whole idea behind Forebeat was kind of taking the drum set and just drums in general and kind of bringing it into a melodic lens. A lot of my favorite drummers have that quality. Like Mitch Mitchell was one of my first favorite drummers growing up, from Jimi Hendrix, Elvin Jones, Art Blakey, Vinnie Colaiuta. A lot of my favorite players kind of take it in that direction, and I wanted to be able to kind of showcase that in this project at Forebeat as a whole, and then it kind of just pops out in my improvisational playing. I've taken like kind of this rhythms, like taking on one drum and then moving maybe one partial of it to a different drum, and then the melodies just kind of come out, and I do my best to either hold on to them, or what usually happens is I kind of just, it becomes kind of a linear structure where I often don't return to the original idea.
Right.
Which this piece, it does kind of return to it a little bit, I think, but with the second track, with all the effects and the string instrument, since that was a totally separate improvisation, it kind of becomes like this new product at the end.
Help me figure out kind of the two improvisations that are happening. Like, where is the line on that?
So the first part of the song, that's all one complete take, and that was actually just me goofing around, and Mark, engineer, he just happened to press record at the right time. I think he was making coffee and heard me playing and rushed into his living room and pressed like record as soon as I started. And then we listened to that whole thing, that whole one track, and then it's like, yeah, this is good, but it kind of needs something. And then earlier that day, I'd also done that kind of ambient synth and what's called like a zither, that string plucked instrument. And then he just like, well, what if we just do this, and just plopped it on top of it. That technique is called like xenocrity, or xenochrony. I've only read it only read it and never actually pronounced it out loud, but it's Frank Zappa used it a lot in the studio. He would take a drum track from one song and a bass track from another and just plop them on top of each other, and then somehow it would mesh, but then they would also kind of pull away from each other, and just that whole idea was just, we love Frank Zappa, and we just thought we'd try it out, and it actually worked really well, I think.
Interesting. Somehow. You brought out something in my mind. I'm thinking of like piano phase with Steve Reich.
Steve Reich, yeah.
I love that idea of, as they kind of depart, and then you keep stretching them farther and farther apart, but eventually they end up lining back up again. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because in some ways that made me think about how those interact and pull away and then come back, and then have this, I don't know, kind of that synchronous, where they're synchronous again. One of the things that jumped out at me, and this is for the listeners too, and I don't know how many people realize that drums are tuned to a pitch. And I don't necessarily think many people think of drums as like a standard 5-piece drum set as something being a pitched instrument in a way.
Right.
But I was curious, because of how some of the synths come in, did you make a particular effort to tune your drums or tune the synth so that it would line up? Because there's some parts where the resonance that's happening with your toms basically kind of comes in and hits like the same pitches as that. I wasn't sure if that was part of your process, is thinking about how the lining those things up, or our own subconsciously our need to balance things sometimes happen, like kind of like if you're like trying to sing something that's in a different key that somebody else is trying to sing, if somebody's singing something else, like because their pitch is there, it kind of pulls you into being in the same pitch, if that made any sense. I don't know if that's something that happens, or
I don't generally tune my drums to certain pitches, so that was definitely coincidence.
Okay.
For sure. I find that when I do tune my drums, there is like a power chord kind of sound, like the bass drum is like the root, the floor tom is the fifth, and then the rack tom is the octave. Kind of becomes that just by tuning by... I just tune by what I like, by what sound I like. There is like a part of the drum community that like tunes like exact pitches to each song. I don't have the patience for that, and I admire people that do that, but it's definitely not something I do.
They're called timpani players. No.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I got my bachelor's in percussion performance, so I'm very familiar.
Gotcha.
With all that, with the tuning fork and all that stuff.
Oh my gosh. No, that's I've never played the timpani, but sorry for my tangent here, but I cannot think of one thing more stressful than the idea of like, if you had to change the pitch of the timpani during the song, because I've watched, like me being the person that just wants to find that really anxious thing to think about, I'll watch the timpani players and they're just doing that, they're just finding the right pitch and just getting it just so, like during the middle of a song, and I'm just like, if you couldn't get it tuned just in time to land it,
that's honestly, I mean, as a having been in that seat before, that's like the hardest part. Playing the rhythms on the page is cake. It's stuff in between. Counting the measures, you're usually counting like 80 plus measures before you hit a single note.
Yeah. I thought about this as kind of this narrative, because that's how I appreciate things, I think, in some ways. Sometimes I appreciate its formlessness, but I was thinking about, I basically had to resort to, I want to say like impressions, but kind of in a slight narrative. And it's interesting that you described that it's the first 30 seconds is kind of this trying to figure things out feel.
Yeah.
This is going to feel very disjointed, but I said blindfold, like as if a person blindfolded, and then trying to find balance, situation choppy, finding balance. And then there's this, that when you're hitting the bell, there's kind of this echolocating, kind of this trying to get your bearings by what's happening around you, and sending out a signal to see what bounces off so that you can find your balance. Alone, solo, but control, carried away. Balance is created by letting go and being carried by the waves, because I was also picked up by the word current, which has many different meanings in itself. But at a certain point, there's like a feeling of control, feels control, even anticipating the chaos, accepting the chaos, and by accepting the chaos, you find balance. Blindfold comes off, empty room. That was the narrative that developed in my head, and then I basically had my words and then listened to it, and I was like, does that still fit? But maybe I'll go back to your technique, because one of the things that I do find interesting about your work is that concept of kind of, you create the sense of that there is a pocket, there's a rhythm center, almost as if you give yourself an opportunity to you're counting things out. One of the things that happens in this is as I listen to your hi-hat, that is just clicking off. And I'm sure that I'm not counting this right, but it's just like it in my brain, it's just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then everything else around it kind of dances. And it's this very, I don't know, it's such a playful kind of freeing thing, because in a certain sense you feel grounded, but then you also feel uplifted, which I don't, I know I'm entitled to my interpretation, but I'm curious about how you think about what you're creating in terms of these abstract pieces, or even kind of abstract flowing into concrete images.
When I try to play Out of Time, I find, and then I listen back to the recording of that, of me trying to play Out of Time, I find there's still kind of a rhythm happening. And something I was thinking about during this piece, that improvisation, was just kind of this idea of like oscillation. You heard the like hi-hat keeping a rhythm there. Something I like to do is to like take a pattern, like bugga da bugga da bugga da bugga, and then like kind of increase or decrease the subdivisions of it. So bugga da 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 bugga da, while keeping like one limb consistent. To me, at least, it kind of gives like a sense of motion in a way. The title of the piece, I named the title after the fact. I think most of them didn't have titles. Maybe a couple of them that were more structured did, but this one, Currents, I was going to call it Currents of Causality, which is the manga Berserk. The whole idea of that manga is like, you know, there's a warrior, no matter how hard he tries to fight against fate, the currents of causality bring him to that conclusion, no matter how hard he struggles. I just made it Currents because I didn't want to fully, you know, weeb out on the title.
Right.
But I thought it was kind of interesting how this one improvisation and then the second improvisation, you layer them on top of each other and match the, you know, the end markings on the stem, and then that somehow created a cohesive enough composition.
This is a good time for me to tell you what my favorite part of the piece is.
Yeah, please.
So it's hard to describe, but if you're listening to the song and you are paying attention to the time, it's like right at 3:57. I mean, whatever, you could say it's 3:50, but there's a part at which I guess you could say where I don't know, is that it must be a synth that you've got where it's like, you know, just this really gritty electric, and I feel like that has this wonderful moment of a little bit of terror, a little bit of like the piece itself feels like it's hitting its point of resolve, where it's getting its direction, where it's feeling, I don't know how to explain it, but it to me, it's got that grounded sound of the synth that is kind of I don't know, in some ways it partially feels aggressive, but also feels very like blankety. You can wrap yourself in it, but at the same time is just these, you know, I want to say your runs with the toms and the kick drum, and it's kind of thunderous in a way and like tumultuous, but also getting itself more into control and more focused, and like emotionally to me it feels like it's coming to kind of either accept the chaos or like finally control the chaos. And so it to me that's what I like. I like the, I don't know, it felt like that was the point of the whole piece. So that's one of the parts that I really like. I mean, I kind of like your I'm gonna just throw this in there too, but I really like your improv melody that's created, but it's broken up into these 3-note kind of statements. And I always think of I kept thinking of it as these 3 versions of what you can interpret current as. You're like, I want to make sure I get this right. So it's either the now, so it's current, or it's like electricity, something that drives, so it's like current that drives an engine. It's like the current in a flowing river. Wow. I thought about these 3 notes, and it's just like they're each giving their own, and I kept thinking those were the you know, brains focus around that triad, you know, where that's the balance, is there's these 3 things. And so there's the current now, there's the current electricity, and then there's the current flow. And so I kept thinking of those three notes as those are the three currents.
That's interesting.
So
I dig that.
So I'm just throwing that out there as kind of I'm going to say a bonus favorite thing. I'm curious what your favorite part in this piece is.
I really enjoy kind of right when the second like overlapping section, like the string instrument comes in. At first, when I heard the two together and as the complete thing, I was like, it kind of takes too long for that zither, the plucking thing to come in.
Huh.
But after listening to it a few more times, I was like, I kind of like it because it just kind of all of a sudden the mood of the piece changes at that point. I take a lot of inspiration from like, there's like a few movie soundtracks that I really enjoy. One being like Hereditary and Midsummer. Those two soundtracks I think are just very good at like building tension, but not in like the typical horror movie way. There's like this sense of dread that it brings up. I felt like it kind of emulated that in this piece, and I wanted to like, I really just kind of enjoyed how that occurred. I really appreciate hearing your take on it because I'm not like super great with words, and I'm not like, when I listen to music, I don't really listen to music for the lyrics. I'm mainly like as far as like I listen for melody, rhythm, basically all the other components. It's easier for me to play my emotions out than to like kind of, express them through words. It's cool to hear someone who you seem very well versed in your verbiage, and having listened to other podcasts like with more instrumental music, like I think with like Reggie Chapman, you did a great job of kind of expressing yourself on that. It's interesting as an instrumentalist hearing that kind of perspective.
Well, thank you. We kind of touched on this a little bit. You said so it was Mark White mixed or that recorded and mixed this, and then Anthony Gruvino did the mastering.
Mastering, correct.
I'm kind of curious because in my brain I kind of picture a large room that you recorded the drums in, but I don't get that's how it was, because the way that you said that it was not like really. It was like I almost got the impression it was like a living room.
Yeah. So the studio we recorded this in was in Mark White's living room. Me and him go way back to like 2013 when we first met, and he is pretty underrated as far as like a mixing engineer. He puts in so much time and effort into his recording setup. His living room is like super dry, and he does that intentionally. Keeps it very dry, and that way he can add the reverb using like these crazy like European cracked plugins or something like this. I think in the last record he used one that like sampled like a missile silo or something. He does the work that I really dislike doing as far as recording. I love to improvise, and he loves to kind of sit down and like we'll listen to the same take over and over again and add these little tweaks to the EQ or the reverb just to get to the right sound. And the main note I told him was like, I want the drums to sound like you're like standing right next to them, and like you can kind of, that you're like living inside of them in a way, so that you can just hear every single click or tap, like very vulnerable in a way, kind of going back to that.
I'm guessing that the setup very close mic'd on a lot of things.
Yeah, close mic. Every drum was mic'd. I think the top and bottom of the snare were mic'd, I'm pretty sure. And then you had like one or two room mics as well, just capturing like almost every angle of the drums.
The sound is a very different, it's very tactile, because it's very much like someone who records some kind of ASMR where it's just like right up against and it's like right there. Or it's something that's way off here. You get the sense that the mics are not missing anything from the drum set.
Yeah.
You slip and you hit one of the rims or something that, with your fingers or anything like that, and that's going to show up in there. Why did you pick this piece to be the piece you wanted to talk about today?
Well, I felt that it had the story behind it, how it was pieced together from like two separate improvisations. I believe this was the first improvisation I did of the day after having spent that, afternoon/evening at Allerton Park, kind of studying the bird sounds. And there's another track on the album called Don't Forget to Look Up, where as I was walking through the forest trails, I would be staring straight forward in front of me. And of course, that's beautiful. But every now and then I would remind myself, if I look up, the sky is peeking through the trees. And that just gave me a whole new perspective. And just having that reminder I was like, that'd be a great name for one of these pieces. But yeah, that's kind of why I picked it, because I felt like, it kind of encapsulates everything that the stages of growth kind of was. It's just like, take the mistakes I thought that were in the beginning section and kind of embracing that as like, this is me developing the idea. Why not share that development with, the listener?
Champagne is Also a Band podcast is proud to support Jubilee Cafe. Jubilee Cafe is a free weekly meal program at Community United Church of Christ, 805 South 6th Street in Champaign, Illinois. Jubilee Cafe serves a home-cooked meal from 5 to 6:30 each Monday. Their mission is to feed hungry people by cooking healthy, delicious meals and by serving their guests restaurant-style with servers waiting on tables. Jubilee Cafe is open to anyone who cares to eat with them. Because food insecurity among students is so high, they serve students as well as others in and around the Champaign-Urbana community who struggle with hunger. Meals are free to all and will be served each Monday evening, located in the accessible lower level of the building at 6th and Daniel Streets in Champaign. For more information on the meal or how to volunteer, go to the Jubilee Cafe CUCC Facebook page or email them at jubilee.cafe@community-ucc.org. That's jubilee.cafe@community-ucc.org. Welcome back. So, James, what is your favorite Champaign-Urbana venues, past or present?
Past or present? Well, that's really tough, as I've been a part of the broader Champaign-Urbana music scene since 2008, 2009. Man, as far as like past ones, the Iron Post was a huge one for me. And actually, I remember performing there when I was in high school with the Central Jazz bands. Mr. John Curry, he would book us gigs there, and just having that experience was so incredible. And Paul was such a amazing person. He booked my first full-length Forebeat gig, because until then, I had been playing at house shows. Like, I had to write it down. Ghost Planet was my first show I did ever with Forebeat. And then once I started picking up, I wanted to kind of do like longer sets. I either emailed Paul or I maybe asked him in person, and he was like, yeah, sure, and gave me like a full 2-hour chunk, and was like, yeah, charge whatever cover you want. I think I charged like $7 or something, and I promoted the heck out of it and managed to pack the joint with just my first Forebeat show. And it was very challenging trying to cover 2 1-hour sets of all improvised material, but it pushed me to that, and I really appreciated that. And like, that was kind of like my, I don't know, like my laboratory in a way to like be able to explore Forebeat.
In a way, didn't that kind of help you cut your teeth? Had you had a project like this before?
A lot of my projects in the past, like band-wise, had some sort of improvisation in it, like A Square Peg Surrounded by Round Holes. That was a project with my friend Eric Hershey, like in 2009 to 2010 or 11 maybe, where we would play basement shows, house shows, whatever, and just like improvise for 30 minutes, not write any material, just improvise. That was kind of something similar. This was my first time doing a solo project, and then a solo project fully improvised. So trying to cover all of that was very challenging. And also, like, it was something I'd been wanting to do for many, many years, but thought like I'd always have a voice saying, like, in my head saying, like, no one's going to want to hear drums for 2 hours straight, I've kind of realized that there weren't a lot of projects like that happening. And once I started doing it, the reception I got was very positive, surprisingly positive. And there was actually 3 people who inspired me to do it. When I was at Eastern getting my percussion degree, I had 2 professors, Bradley Decker, who's the composition professor there, also plays in Champaign, I think, in Beat Kitchen and Los Guapos. And he's a bassist and also fabulous composer. And then Jamie Ryan, who is my percussion professor, who plays in Sun Stereo now. I did a lot of like these wacky multi-percussion pieces with Jamie. And then I had composition lessons with Bradley Decker. We did a lot of acousto-electronic stuff. So having that experience, I think Jamie said, like, you could take some of this stuff, and when you're playing in your punk bands, they could take a break and you could just do like a acoustic electronic solo. Kind of put that in my back pocket. And then a few years later, I had moved to Indianapolis for a little bit, and I started working at the Percussive Art Society, which is this kind of like international organization for like higher ed percussion folks, like archiving pieces and educational material for college students and high schoolers and anybody really. And there was a percussionist / composer, Rob Funkhauser, who I met. He is a wacky dude, an awesome guy. But he did a lot of like contact mic on like random stuff. Like I remember me and him were working together, and he had a piece of poster board with a contact mic on it and was bowing it and making these like insane, like shrieking sounds. And he's like, "Oh, I'm going to play that at my gig tonight." I was like, "Oh, gig?" He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm playing at this venue and I'm going to do like my avant-garde percussion stuff." I was like, man. And so I was like, him doing that inspired me to kind of like, okay, there is an audience for this. And even then, like, he's having fun making music he enjoys. Who needs an audience even as well? So once I moved back to Champaign, I kind of got like the idea, like, okay, well, I'm kind of back in my home, like my stomping grounds, I guess. It was hard to kind of book things in Indianapolis at the time. When I moved back to Champaign, I kind of just asked around and eventually booked at the Ghost Planet, where it was basically just a drum solo. Where I was doing my best Zach Hill impression. But yeah, sorry, that was kind of a long tangent. But yeah, I guess like
you really described kind of a really good progression about how you got into this. Now, you're currently studying percussion. I'm going to get this all wrong, but percussion at the University of Illinois, or do I have it wrong?
No, you got it right. See, I've already graduated, but I got my master's in jazz performance at the University of Illinois.
Okay. Yeah,
I took like an 8-year break between degrees.
My brain just seems to think that because I remember when you announced that you were going to do that, and it in my brain that wasn't that long ago, but so I assume that you were still. It wasn't.
Yeah. It was only a 2-year program, so that's why.
That makes sense.
I'm still there quite often.
But you brought up a really interesting. Can I say loss? Is the Iron Post.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I don't know if people will ever understand if they didn't see such a variety of stuff. I've seen hardcore shows there. Mm-hmm. I've seen big band jazz. I've seen, I don't know, but I've seen Pygmalion shows there. I've seen like just Tuesday nights, here's the local high school band. Here's the, like you said, Central, right? Yeah. So sorry, I didn't grow up here. So my brain is just like Central.
It's very important.
Yeah, Central. I know. My partner is a Central grad, and it's very important. It's somehow managed to have, without being stated, this community aspect of like all sorts of different kinds of music can exist here and function here. I don't know. I think that is one of those things where I just feel like it's a loss that we don't have that venue anymore. Yeah. So I wish there was a way for it to be revived, or at least some essence of it to return.
I will say, like, going into like my current favorite venues, I have like 2.
Oh yeah,
currently.
Sorry.
But and I totally agree with like Iron Post. Like, it started totally community driven. Like the monthly series Soul on Sunday started there, and I remember going there, seeing like hardcore shows. I played with Pamela Makala there as a singer songwriter. I would play, Forebeat avant-garde stuff. One of my favorite shows I ever played was I did a show with Mermaid Heaven. I played Forebeat, and then Mermaid Heaven played after. That was like one of my favorite bills. And I think like 2 venues that are doing a really great job of kind of filling that gap is like the Rose Bowl and then the Gallery Art Bar. Those 2 are just doing a great job of filling that, especially like Rose Bowl, having the tent. Oh my God, it's so great. Every summer, like that's like my favorite place to go to and favorite place to play. And then Gallery Art Bar with just, Jonah willing to book, like, when to give me a Friday evening slot for my album release show was very generous. Having like the projections that Matt Harsh and Jake Metz, kind of helped set up in that room. And the room, it's a very difficult room to make sound good, but they have treated it in a way where it sounds as best as it possibly could, in my opinion. So it's And then, of course, the Rose Bowl with their ability, their streaming abilities. I played a Forebeat show at the Rose Bowl ownership change. And it was like a Sunday afternoon. And it was like Prairie Noise Invasion. It was me and 3 or 4 other noise acts. And it the stage still had the guardrail.
Yep. I was there.
You were there?
I think that was the first time I saw you.
That's right. I mean, it was like the vibes were interesting.
Yeah.
it was pretty amazing.
I mean, I think it was, Of Course You Realize.
Yeah. And shout out Karthik from Of Course You Realize. He was one of the first people that really kind of started helping me book more shows and putting me on bills. Like, he saw me at that first show at Ghost Planet in 2018, and it was kind of really helped me build that. And then Jason Finkelman saw me at that first Iron Post show, and then me and him have had a great musical relationship. I collaborate with him through the Improvisers Exchange series, which that as well is another great aspect of the community.
I guess we're kind of touching on many of these elements, but what do you think makes a good music scene? I
think just a willingness to build community. One thing I really like about the current scene, having had taken a break between 2008 and 2012, I was kind of I was going to house shows, and this is kind of more geared towards the house show scene, I guess. I was mainly kind of there, kind of as a fly on the wall. I'd watch the bands, and I'd play in some of the bands, but I never really made it through my social anxiety. I never really made an effort to be a part of it, like an active member of it. But then kind of being reacquainted with it, recently through playing in bands like Mango Pods and Sweet Milk, I've noticed that the community itself has gotten a lot more diverse and is not as this kind of macho gatekeeping sort of vibe, which it wasn't the majority of the people back then, but I think those kinds of people kind of kept it from kind of flourishing. And I think now, with the house show scene, it's gotten so much more inclusive, and I think having that has allowed some of those bands to be able to branch out into the venues like Rose Bowl, Gallery Art Bar, The Space, C4A, IMC, and then even now they're playing up in Chicago, where where they're doing some awesome things up there. So I don't know, it's just, I think making a good music scene, there has to be this openness to bring new people in and allow them the space to kind of grow and succeed.
You brought up a good point of the voice of the gatekeeper. I feel like back in the day, that voice was a lot louder.
Yeah.
And even though there were less people behaving in that way, they were certainly louder. And I feel like, at least from my perspective, and I'm only speaking from my perspective, which is limited, it seems that at least the inclusive voice has become the louder voice. Mm-hmm. And there's already more people in that group that are trying to be inclusive and be louder, which I feel like has done a lot for making the music scene a more welcoming one and a place for growth, which is cool.
Yeah, when you have these, diverse backgrounds and, perspectives, you're getting not only that benefit, but also the music. You get a wider variety of music. Not every band sounds the same. I think that's a really great, as a listener, I enjoy that, going to shows and hearing a hardcore band and then an indie kind of tinge and then some hip hop, and then it's just a great mix of genres.
Champagne is Also a Band podcast is proud to support Exile on Main Street. Exile on Main Street, located in the old train station building at 100 North Chestnut Street in downtown Champaign, has been helping to build record collections since 2004. Carrying a wide array of new and used LPs, CDs, and video games. Exile on Main Street has something for just about any music enthusiast and old-school gaming devotee. Exile also hosts regular free live music shows on its stage, so be sure to check out their Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages for the up-to-date details on the next upcoming event. Open 7 days a week, they can be reached by phone at 217-398-MAIN. That's 217-398-6246. Jamie, what is your favorite non-musical thing or things?
That's a tough one. I guess not so much really. Recently, I've gotten into trading card games, and specifically the One Piece trading card game.
Oh, really?
I think like 2 years ago, I started reading the One Piece manga on like the phone app. And I don't know if you know much about One Piece. It's like one of the longest running, or maybe the longest running manga series. I think they're up to like chapter 1140.
Whoa.
And as opposed to like Dragon Ball, which I think Dragon Ball has like 300 or 400, and that has ended at this point. So I got really into that, and I've caught up to the current chapter, and the series is still going. So I'm like hungry for more One Piece stuff.
Yeah.
My daughter, who's 8, has gotten into Pokemon cards a little bit.
Yeah.
Just enjoys like, the Eevees and the Pikachus and that sort of thing. I would take her to like card shops and pick out a pack, and then I would see like the One Piece cards kind of in the side. I was like, oh, those kind of look cool. And then eventually I bought myself a starter deck. I was like, man, these cards, like the designs on the artwork is great. The foil ones look super textured and really cool.
Yeah.
And so I started buying a few more booster packs as time went on. And I was like, I've got enough cards. I should probably start learning how to play it. Eventually did. So like the past 2 months, I've been kind of diving into that. And I actually just did my second locals tournament last night. And got 8th out of 9th place, which I didn't think is too bad, but I'm enjoying it. And it's interesting to talk to a few other musician friends who like have side hobbies that aren't music, like how it's interesting to kind of put yourself in like a new hobby where you're like completely unexperienced and having to kind of start from scratch. There's like a totally different community too. Like I've never seen any of these people in this trading card game community before, and just kind of, it's kind of nice to have like a different circle besides music, because then like once you go back into the music circle, you're coming at it refreshed, and it's not like you're constantly in that, which I kind of felt I was for quite a while.
My only trading card game that I ever really did anything with was Magic the Gathering, of course.
Yeah.
Does it function similarly? Really similar? No. Does it function in the same way?
I remember as a kid, I would collect some of the Magic the Gathering cards. I don't know if I ever actually learned how to play it. I think it's kind of similar to that, and also Pokemon, where it's like you have a commander, like you have like a guy, and then you have like smaller bodies that fill the field and attack for you.
Yeah.
Basically, you have like a certain amount of life, which are like 3 to 5 cards. And if you attack that leader enough times, you lose all your cards, and that's your life, and then the game's over. So I don't know, does that sound kind of similar?
Yeah, similar. I mean, you have cards that are like your attackers and blockers, and you draw power from somewhere. In Magic, it's mana, and then it's basically, that's how you power or cast the spell to
that's
summon
kind of how
them.
it is.
So interesting. Okay. And then you've collected these cards. You probably assemble decks, right? In much the same way, and then you play against. Okay. And so where was this tournament held?
I went to Gopher Mafia Games in Urbana, and I also go to Titan Games in Champaign.
Gotcha.
As well.
Very cool.
Those 2 places.
And then do they have, if people wanted to find out about this, like how often do they have tournaments?
They have like pretty much every week. I know Gopher Mafia Games has theirs every Wednesday, I think around like 7 o'clock. And then Titan Games, they do like free play once, like they kind of alternate it every 2 weeks. So free play 1 week, and the next week is a structured tournament.
Okay.
And I think they have them on their Instagrams and Facebooks. That's kind of how I keep up to date on that.
Cool.
But yeah, it's like a whole new scene that I'm like kind of diving into as opposed to the music scene.
Isn't that always the way? It's like all you need is to just get your feet wet into anything that you're not familiar with at all, and then you find out how expansive it is, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like a whole big world that you didn't know existed or didn't realize how complex it is. Jamie, thank you for being on the show and telling me about your piece, the album Stages of Growth, your favorite Champaign-Urbana venues, what makes a great music scene, and your favorite non-musical things. So I appreciate you coming all the way out here and chatting with me.
Yeah, definitely, of course. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the time, talking about my piece and album. So Thank you for giving me the space to do that. Thank you for listening to Champagne is Also a Band podcast. This is James from Forebeat, or Jamie, reminding you, great music is out there. Go find it where you live.
That's a wrap.
Champagne is also a band.
You almost have an NPR voice. It's so good.
Studio sounds bigger on the inside.
So bucket, you know.